All right. So it is now 5 after. We have seemed to work through our technical difficulties. We are trying a new webinar software, and we encountered an exciting behavior that is new to us. So let's dive in. So I'm Zach Grant. Before we start, let's give a tiny bit of context. So these are supposed to be insights from a business conference. And like all business conferences, pretty much the interesting conversations happen between the sessions and after the sessions. And it's not that the sessions aren't interesting, but usually the real value comes from the talks with people. I'd like it if this webinar can have that feel, a more conversational talk after the event where we've all been thinking about what's been going on during the day and we're a bit more relaxed. So as mentioned, I'm Zach Grant. To give you a bit of context, I'm the head of global marketing at Magnolia. I've been here since 2012. My background is as a web, free software and open source startup and nonprofit veteran. And some of the places that I've been that you might recognize include MySQL AB, the Open Source Initiative, the Free Software Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, and Easy Systems. So let's pretend that we're having a chat after the event has run down. And we're asking each other questions like, how was it? Do you think it was worth going? This topic is a bit overhyped. What did you actually learn? And did anything blow your mind? Now, we can't actually have a real conversation, which is a bit of a shame, but I can usually hold up my own end of the conversation without any help whatsoever. So let's see how this goes. So first, a tiny bit of boring background. We co-sponsored the event, and we spoke together with Aaron Sapel from American Express at the event. What we're sharing today are our general impressions and our insights, mostly from speaking with event attendees, from the talks with Aaron before the event, and with chats with some of our clients before the event happened. We wanted to make sure that we understood how digital transformation was unfolding at various customer sites. And we're not trying to present Forrester's advice or content from the event itself. That, of course, is Forrester's content, which I recommend seeking out. Also, many thanks to Aaron Sapel. It was great that he would present with us at the event, and a lot of the insights on digital transformation are really his. So first, what was the event like? If you weren't there, you would have noticed there were a lot of people wearing suits, and generally dark blazers with blue dress shirts. Slightly older crowd, a lot of really senior attendees, so executives, managers of larger companies, and so on. Pretty diverse backgrounds, and I think we can sum this up easily by one of the comments, or some of the comments from after our presentation. One attendee said, "That was great, I really wish it had been more technical." And another attendee came and said, "Oh, that was interesting, but it was too technical for me and went over my head." And we had pretty much the full gamut at the event, ranging from people who mostly deal with the concepts around digital transformation to people leading initiatives, and people ranged from, well, all disciplines, really. The event itself was exceptionally well produced. Being in marketing, I produce a lot of events myself, and I would say this is the gold standard for events that I've been to. The content was good. It was absolutely valuable, but it's a lot of the content that Forrester shares with its customers throughout the year. The real value, the best value, if you're not a Forrester client, is certainly going there to meet face-to-face with analysts and peers. The conversations were really good. So what did we learn at the event? And I would say that there are two big learnings that we took away. So one is just how important it is to mind the very large gap between knowing something and actually understanding it, the gap between knowledge and wisdom. And I think the other key learning we took away is really that digital transformation is a cultural adaptation, a cultural response to new technology. Let's start with the gap piece. First, attending the event, talking with the attendees, speaking with the vendors, showing off their solutions, I was struck at just how wide the gap has gotten in a pretty short amount of time. Some of it is about the scope of the new technologies available, and they're not necessarily new technologies. A lot of them are old technologies or dreams for technology that are now working. And these are things like low code platforms that remind one of 4GL and 5GL from 20, 30 years ago. But in this case, these actually seem to work. They actually seem to provide people with a visual toolkit for assembling apps without having to be developers. The smart contract solution based on artificial intelligence, awfully big phrase, let's say machine recognition of the meaning of content, fascinating. Changes the game around management of contracts if you have large volumes of them. And then all of the robotic procedure automation and artificial intelligence or machine learning solutions, the voice control things, everything put together was pretty impressive because it's stuff we dreamed of that actually seems to start working now. But put together, these things are taking us into a pretty weird space. The gap is getting bigger and deeper, faster, and really, I think, weirder than I had realized. And this is speaking as someone who's in the industry, who works for a vendor of one of these types of technologies. To illustrate why I think things are getting so weird, let's put this into context. Let's use information encoding over the millennia as an example. So if we look back at the start of information encoding technology, here we have Sumerian accounting technology from 10,000 years ago. This is a set of clay tokens that represent physical goods like crops harvested. They would be packed up in a clay ball, and this would be used to represent taxes. This was a way to make it so that information that one person knew could be understood by someone else without them actually having to talk. And let's say for the speed of encoding our thoughts down to a physical form or some sort of representation, this is the 1x speed. This is the base speed that we had to encode information. If you jump ahead 4,000 years, this set of tokens and the clay envelope that it went into evolved into writing when someone realized that you could actually just write, you could make a mark to represent what was in the envelope without actually having to have anything in the envelope. But that's a 4,000-year gap. It was also arbitrarily, roughly, a tenfold increase in speed, because instead of making clay tokens and then baking them and then sticking them in a clay envelope and drawing on the outside, you just have to draw the symbols, and it's a lot faster. And then we fast forward a bunch through better writing technologies and paper and other ways to, other medium for storing written info. And we jump ahead to the printing press. 5,000 years elapse, and we have 100-fold increase in speed. So much faster than someone just encoding information the old-fashioned way. And we jump ahead again to say just 100 years ago, and we have modern offset presses, the type that can spit out thousands and thousands of copies of newspapers very rapidly. And this is, say, a 10,000 increase in speed. And then finally, we jump ahead to where we are now. And we have the web, we have the internet, and who knows how much faster it allows us to disseminate copies of knowledge. This in itself is interesting and weird because we've gone so far from the abilities that are tied to one person to really what technology lets us do. If we look at what we're sharing here, then we move away from just the scale being quite large and the speed of change. Notice how quickly we've gone from 100-fold to 10,000-fold to really hard to calculate fold, to a million fold perhaps. If we look at what we did with these technologies, the first version was about accounting. We shared records for bookkeeping. The middle technologies let us start sharing culture, like, say, the Bible, um, and they let us share knowledge, instructions on how to do things, systems of knowledge, philosophy, poetry, all these pieces of culture and wisdom that we could easily put down in a written form. And with the net and digital technologies, we added something really new, and this is just in the last 100 years, give or take a millennium if you take into account things like automated looms. But mostly, if we look at digital, digital lets us take some sort of representation of human skill, how to do something, and make it runnable as a piece of software. And now we can easily share that quickly and nearly at no cost over the net. And things get really strange. With a book, with written materials, you have to read them to understand. The gap between data, knowledge, and wisdom is large. But here, with code, there's a strange relationship between knowledge and the ability to apply it. You don't have to know something to necessarily apply the results of knowing it, which is really interesting. The reason why things get so spooky at this point is that almost all of the technologies that we've dealt with up to this point, they're about people using tools. Language really is just a tool, so is data, when it's presented the right way. But once you add the net into the mix, what you end up with, the net and some of these new technologies like AI, you get the really bizarre state of our tools are starting to use our tools. So we have cases like with robotic procedure automation where, I wouldn't say intelligent systems, that's a big stretch, but where smarter tools are able to do things like invoke code on our behalf. And that's really a strange meta state to be in. I was really struck by that at the event, at talking with people. Another thing that really struck me about how big the gap is between our understanding of the tech industry as a whole, even as participants, as vendors, as people who build solutions based on software, and what is actually possible in the near future, came from talking with people about how they use their complex technology platforms. So we have, in chatting with people at the event, any number of them talked about using large, complicated systems, suites of technologies. And then they talked about using just one part of a large complex suite with just one part of another large complex suite to solve a problem that they've got in a not elegant but efficient way. Sometimes I felt this was because we don't even really understand the capabilities of the platforms that we work with. We use them in ways that are efficient, but maybe not the ways they were designed for. And I found a great metaphor for this from my childhood. I remember seeing this when I lived in Arkansas with a different kind of car. So watch the video. So here we have a fancy car being converted into a wood splitter. Probably not really what the entire platform was meant for. But often what I see in technology, we just need to get our jobs done. And sometimes we use really complex, expensive platforms to do things that are better done by a smaller, dedicated tool. And this really got me thinking about really what's the right approach to dealing with complex platforms and high rates of change. How does this influence what we need to do with our digital transformation strategies? And working with the conversations that I had with Aaron, with conversations with other attendees, with what some of our clients told us, we've sort of got a more unified theory to work with about what does digital transformation look like in this time of really rapid and weird change, a time where our software tools are now running software tools on our behalf. The first thing is that, as with practically every other major technology change in history, um, digital transformation, which is, say, a technologically driven transformation, is about adapting our cultures to deal with a new technology. So it's a shift in how we organize. And it's not necessarily a tremendously new shift. We already know all of the principles about digital transformation. It's understanding how to make them relevant when we're faced with this sort of rapid change and large gap. So the first thing is, because it's a wide scale change and it needs to happen in a short amount of time, if we go back to those examples I had earlier, the gap between proto writing, between those clay tokens embedded in a clay envelope, and actual writing was 4,000 years. That is enough time to adapt to the technological change involved or to the cultural change involved. Um, in our case, most of us within our lifetime are seeing unexpected, unpredicted changes happening, and we have to deal with them in our working life. To transform a large organization, an enterprise, to deal with this reality requires a critical mass of people within the organization. It can't come from one person or one group. They have to be motivated and they have to be empowered to deal with the change um, in ways that are uncomfortable for older, more hierarchical organizations. Or let's even put aside hierarchical. Let's say instead obedience driven organizations. It requires a new role from leadership. And some companies already behave this way, but a lot more companies need to focus on having their leaders catalyze the change and to keep in mind the big context that they're working in. It's less command and control. So when we talk about catalyzing, concretely, I think these are the things that matter. Leaders need to set the right objectives in conjunction with the people they work with. The people that do the work in the company need to be empowered. And I'll talk more about that in more detail and the right objectives in a few minutes. The technology they work with needs to let them be efficient. And it's the leader's job to try and make sure that empowering technologies are chosen instead of disempowering technologies. And the last, I think, critical thing is that leaders need to make sure that there are healthy, effective feedback and communication loops to allow for course corrections rapidly when you have to deal with new change or changes that come rapidly. So if setting the right objectives is important, what do the right objectives look like? Ideally, they should be meaningful to the people who are tasked with achieving them. They have to be clear and understandable, and they need to be strategic, meaning that the short-term objectives need to align with the long-term objectives, roughly. They should be data-driven, measurable, and have associated KPIs. And this matters because it forces you to do your thinking about what is significant up front, instead of reviewing work at the end, maybe without criteria, and then trying to make a decision about whether or not it meets some potential goal. Doing it measurably forces you to think up front. It also lets people work independently because they're working towards a defined set of criteria, not towards an uncertain evaluation at the end. And it doesn't mean you don't do evaluations at the end or you don't think during the middle, but it puts some of the uncertainty and risk to one side. The right objectives start small. If you tackle too much scope at once, it gets overwhelming. And for ourselves, we notice when we try to implement OKRs company-wide, OKRs being a system to spread measurable objectives throughout an entire organization. When we tried this across the entire organization, we didn't manage to roll it out successfully. It was quite a challenge. We're doing it again, but on a smaller scope. And there we learn the critical lessons before we try to force everyone to follow them. These things all together make it so that people can work independently because they know and they have to measure their success towards the objectives. The other thing with right objectives is they should encourage positive failure. If the consequence of failure is really high, people hide it, or people avoid it perhaps in stupid ways. They shoot for easy targets. Um, they choose things that they won't lose at. Expect failure. Don't necessarily reward it, but build it into the process as an expectation. And OKRs, for example, that system, um, practitioners often recommend that you should try to hit about 60% of your key objectives. Lower isn't good. And if you're, sorry, yeah, lower isn't good. And if you're hitting more of them, you're probably not pushing yourself enough. But of course, that's very culturally driven. Um, in some companies, a 60% failure rate could make people very nervous, even if it's exactly what's expected. So we find OKRs, perhaps we do a little differently as a European-based company than, say, the American-based companies where they're more popular. So what do empowered people look like? First, they have access to the knowledge they need to do their work, which means there aren't necessarily a lot of boundaries that they have to deal with, or if they're in place, they're very well thought out. They have these clear objectives to work with so they can work independently, so they know if they're making progress on their own. They have the authority to work towards meeting their objectives, as opposed to having to always get authority as they take on new things in service of these objectives. They have the right tools to work with. And to keep them safe as they do this, because empowerment also has risk associated with it, there are checks and balances in place to keep them safe. The objectives are part of these, but reviews throughout also help everyone know if they're aiming the right way. Someone who is fully empowered also takes on all the risk, so we have to strike a balance, or at least for effective transformation. You may be thinking that these sound like pretty good organizational hygiene practices in general, and I think that they really are. This type of structure is about having an organization that is driven by focusing on competence and on transparent communication, instead of being focused on obedience and rigid rules. If you get the right culture in place, it really increases your agility. Empowered people working with the right tools, and I'll talk about those again in a minute, make it so that they can do their work without having to get approval or support from a lot of other people. The right tools usually mean that they don't have to go to a technical specialist, for example, to do their day-to-day job. That lets people deal with opportunities and emergencies much faster. It fosters innovation because it lets people do things in innovative. Now, saying it fosters innovation by letting people be innovative is a bit of tautology, so let's say that differently. It fosters innovation because it lets the people who understand the problems best actually work towards solving them. It gives the organization a lot of resilience because you can correct problems faster. However, with all of these things, we still have to have that good feedback loop mentioned earlier. Someone working on their own who doesn't provide any of their insights back to leadership, back to their teammates, doesn't help them learn from their failures and their successes. So you have to have this empowerment at the edges, but they also have to communicate backwards. The right culture also spreads leadership throughout the organization. With authority and clear objectives, people get to lead at every level of their responsibility across their the things that they're accountable for. And again, I think that really fosters resilience when you're dealing with large amounts of risk. I already covered this about what type of organization this is versus what kind it shouldn't be. If we look at the technology beneath, often I think people's first thought about digital transformation is it's all about the tools And I think the tools are almost a hindsight. They're almost something that just comes afterwards. You need the right tools in place, the right technology in place, but it's not where you start. What you do need is, as you adopt technology, as you change the technology you have, you should choose technology that is highly interoperable. Technology that lets you change pieces of it quickly and ideally in small chunks. Empowering technology makes it easy to solve new problems with your current skills. You shouldn't have to take on a lot of new skill to be able to apply what you already know. And altogether, it should let you be more efficient across the system. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. The interoperability piece. So this is about easier access to data and functionality across systems. It means that you have a system where the sum can be greater than its parts because you can combine your systems in new and different ways. When you need to, you can bolt the log splitter onto the axle of your car and get it to do a task that it was never really meant to do, but you can still solve a problem meaningfully. It's perhaps easier when you have more general purpose parts. It might be easier if you had a separate engine to stick that log splitter onto instead of having to take the wheel off your car so it's not functional for a while. Good interoperability lets your old components age gracefully because you can replace them when you need to, not when you're forced to. Concretely, this looks like having public versioned and documented APIs for the systems that you rely on. It means that they use open standards, or at least de facto standards, so that new technologies that work with the same sorts of information, the same sorts of processes that follow the same standards, can be more easily substituted in place. It means that the architecture of the system is well documented and can be extended in sensible ways, ideally with APIs. But if not, then with the source code itself. And to help deal with the future, ideally there is a public roadmap that helps you understand where your particular tools are going to, so you can understand and influence their interoperability moving forward. The piece about incremental change matters a great deal for having the right tech, because it lets you compartmentalize risk. If you can quickly change a small piece of a system, you can reduce the risk down to ideally a component. And as we know, when you change a piece of a system, you risk breaking things. There are almost always side effects. The more you have to change it once, the more risk you take on. Small pieces usually let you change something. And if something does break that you haven't accounted for, it's often easier to patch and go back to your original state. Being able to change incrementally should also allow you to innovate more quickly, or more precisely, adopt new innovations faster. You can choose a new tool, as long as that tool is interoperable, that gives you new capabilities because your system is already architected for it. So the right technology strategy focuses on technology as being a product that you constantly maintain. So if we try and sum up all of these thoughts that we're trying to integrate from the event, and we had to say it in a sentence, we would say digital transformation is about having a transparent culture where leaders are catalysts that help empower staff while minding the technological gaps in the strategy, the tech strategy, and of course the cultural strategy. It's still rough, but for my part, I came out of the event a much stronger idea of what I think we as an organization should do, what the how should I say, how we perceive our customers' digital transformation efforts, and a better idea of how to understand digital transformation throughout. I've talked a bunch. I'm not sure that we'll have many questions at this point because the number of participants is low. I do have a softball question that came from when we rehearsed this internally. Well, not a softball question, let's say a hardball question, because it's tough. I presented this to some of the marketing team, and they said, so how is our own digital transformation going? And I thought about this, thinking, well, what do we want to say about it? And so I shared the note about OKRs earlier on in our attempt to work towards having a more objective-based culture. But I thought a funny anecdote to share would be from the first time that I encountered the concept of digital transformation within Magnolia. My initial thought was, well, we're already digitally transformed. I mean, for goodness sake, we're a technology vendor. How, how much more digitally transformed do you need to be? And over time, and especially recently, I've come to the understanding that it's about facing the reality that almost all of us cannot really understand how interesting, exciting, and weird digital technologies are going to make our businesses in the near future, and how we have to adapt culturally to deal with that, and how that's about the only strategy that saves us. No tool, no um, no other magic bullet exists beyond minding the cultures that we have. For those who attended, we'll follow up with notes. If you've got questions or want to chat, drop me a line. I might not respond so quickly because I will promptly go on vacation for a few weeks, but hopefully we can chat afterwards, or I'll see you at one of our upcoming events. Thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks to Vero Altenbach, who sat silently in the background cursing at the software and trying to make things work. And we hope to see you again at another webinar.